we are talking about an issue that I think is enormously important. God doesn't always talk to us the way we'd like him to. And one of the funny things we do when we discover that is we complain about how God speaks instead of how we listen. And just as a general orientation, if there's a problem between you and God, I'm just guessing he's right and you're wrong. And so the sooner you adjust to whatever it is he's doing, whether you understand it or not, the happier you'll be. So what I hope to do today is just give a little bit of perspective on that issue of why it is that God at times seems silent. And the way I would like to do that is really by talking about the questions that come to us in the context of silence. It was kind of fun for me to sit in the back and hear Mike Erie talking a little bit about some of the questions, not only that he has had, but that you find in Scripture and the willingness to raise them before God. And he's done a lot of my work before me. He has helped emphasize the fact that we are not only given the freedom to ask God questions, but we're giving that model and really that command to live honestly before him. So let me just begin by having you think a little bit more carefully about the kinds of questions that we sometimes have. And I'm going to just break them into three categories. Sometimes we have what we might call mere questions. In other words, it's merely a question. I just wanted to know. And if you happen to have mere questions, usually mere answers are all you need. You're wondering what time it is. All you need is 3:45. You're good. Mere question, mere answer. And those are very helpful when that's all you need to know. There's another kind of questions, what I think I might call real questions. Not so much because the mere questions are unreal, but because the real questions are somehow far more important to us. These are often questions that we ask about things like the problem of evil. Why are there bad things in the world in which we live? These are questions that puzzle us. We have debates about human freedom and divine sovereignty and questions of this sort, and these are real questions. Unlike mere questions, which get mere answers that really solve them, the bottom line when you have a real question is rarely is there a simple answer that solves it. Usually the answers are difficult and they're hard to figure out. And that's part of why these questions continue to live with us and in some sense haunt us through the years. And then finally, there's a category of what we might call deep questions. And these are the questions that are not really asked of our mind, but of our soul. These are the things that keep us awake at night, that make us fast, that make us pray, that make us cry, that make us shout in anguish to God. These are the questions that, interestingly enough, often have relatively simple answers, but they're just answers that are extremely difficult to accept. If you want a great example, you could imagine Jesus praying that this cup would pass from him, wondering, Lord, am I the one who has to do this? Well, the answer to the question is relatively simple. Yes. The only problem is accepting the answer. And a lot of times the deep questions that we encounter in life really are questions with relatively simple answers. A man named John Claypool had a daughter. He was a Baptist pastor in the early 1960s. The daughter was, of course, a delight to him, a joy to him, and then one day she was diagnosed with leukemia. And 18 months later, she died. And in response to that experience, John Claypool wrote a book. The book is actually called Tracts of a Fellow Struggler. Not so much that the question had a difficult answer or had a complex answer, but it was an answer that was hard for him to accept. And in fact, it was a very good book, and it was well received. But there was one line in the book that led many people to accuse him of blasphemy and led him to have actually a lot of sort of trouble with that book. And that question was this. He wrote, "God, you owe me an explanation." God, you owe me an explanation. I'm not sure that that phrase is blasphemous. I'm not sure how wise or unwise it was to write in the book, but I am sure that for all of the people who may have complained about that, there's 1,000 more who have asked that question or prayed that prayer or shouted that to God through their tears in the midst of a very, very dark night in their own lives. Here's one thing about deep questions. The answers to deep questions are usually preceded by silence. The answers to deep questions are usually preceded by silence. Mainly because I'm not sure God is always confident He has your attention. I was a soccer coach for my daughter's 13-year-old soccer team in the AYSO days. I don't know what possessed me to think this was a good idea. Bringing together 13 to 15, 13-year-old girls just as a concept is a bad one. And we brought them all together, and I'm sitting here, I'm not exactly captain soccer. I don't really necessarily know that much of what I'm doing anyhow. But to try to explain to them anything while they're all sitting there jabbering to each other about the latest escapades of their boyfriends, pseudo-boyfriends, would-be boyfriends, or the boyfriends they wish they had, became very frustrating for me as coach. About 2 days into this experience, I realized that me talking while they were talking was a waste of my time. So rather than shout, I tried silence. And I would just stand there and I would look at them until finally, about a half hour in, one of them would look up and notice that, hey, Coach Langer isn't saying anything. Not that we would have been listening, but he isn't. And then they nudge theirs, and after a while, they finally look up and say, oh, he must want to talk to us. And I would wait with silence until they were silent, because only then could they hear my words. And I think that's exactly what God does with us. Silence is not the absence of communication. It's preparation for communication. God is not quiet because He refuses to talk. He's quiet because He's waiting to talk. And generally speaking, the kind of answers we get from God are in direct proportion to the kind of attention we give to God. And silence is one of the things that God most commonly uses to get our attention. He uses other things, and there are other reasons why there's silence. But what I would like to talk about today is how God uses silence to get our attention so He can answer our deep questions. And the way I'd like to do that is by taking a look at the life of Joseph. If you have a Bible, you could turn to Genesis chapter 37, although I will tell you right now this will be, of course, a little problematic because the story of Joseph goes from Genesis chapter 37 all the way through to Genesis chapter 50. And if I'm going to let you go before dinner time, I'm going to have to give you the Cliff Notes version of this, which I know you're all very familiar with. Cliff Notes, at least, if not Joseph. So I will talk through briefly the story of Joseph just to get that set in our minds. And then I want to talk about some of the questions that might have come up in Joseph's life in light of the experiences that he was having. So we meet Joseph first in chapter 37 of Genesis, and he is the son of Jacob, and indeed we discover he is the favored son because we meet him dressed in a many-colored coat, a sign whatever else it is of, and of course biblical scholars have debated what all the meanings of that coat might be. The one thing that is clear from the text is it was a sign that he was a favored son. This in a context where there were 11 other sons to choose from. And as you can imagine, the fact that Joseph was a favored son led to a certain amount of jealousy on the part of the other 11. On top of that fact, Joseph brought a bad report about the other 11 sons back to Dad. You can guess how that went over. After trying that on for size, he thought he'd do a dream. So he had this wonderful dream about these 11 sheaves out in the field that all came and bowed down to him. His brothers, after a lengthy period of contemplation, suddenly realized, wait a minute, that's us. He's telling a dream, a story about all of us bowing down to him. And that didn't make him any more popular. He followed that up with one more dream. In this case, we had 11 stars all bowing down, but for good measure, we got the sun and the moon, i.e. Mom and Dad, to jump in as well. When it comes to winning friends and influencing people, Joseph was not the brightest bulb in the pack. So he told these stories. His brothers got more and more upset. Finally, one day, they're out tending the flock in the field, and Joseph is sent by Dad to go and see how they're doing, bring another bad report, no doubt. The brothers saw him coming and decided, here's our chance. And they took him and they threw him in a pit to leave him to die. One of his brothers, being an economist, decided, hey, that's a bad move. We could get some money from this kid. So they pulled him back up out of the pit and sold him to some Midianite traders who were going by. So that way they didn't just let him rot, but they got some cash value out of the exchange. So at this point, Joseph goes off to Egypt. And of course, the brothers take the garment that he had and douse it with some goat's blood and bring it back to Dad and say Joseph is dead. Joseph heads down into Egypt, becomes slave of a man named Potiphar, and he is a wonderful slave. And he serves him well, and Potiphar never has any worries in his household for anything except perhaps his wife, who has the hots for Joseph, to put it in modern terms. Is unrelenting in chasing after him. One day she gets the opportunity when no one else is around and kind of asserts herself in this regard. Joseph flees. She grabs the cloak. Next thing you know, she's accusing Joseph of doing something really nasty and has the coat for proof. Joseph gets thrown from being a slave into being a prisoner. He ends up in prison, and again he makes the most of his opportunities. He rises to the top of the prisoner heap. Next thing you know, there's a couple of people thrown in the prison from Pharaoh, a butler and a baker. They have some more dreams. He interprets them. One of them's good, one of them's bad. He tells the one who had the good dream, hey, remember me when you get to see Pharaoh, because I think this is all going to work out. And of course, it does work out, except the part about him remembering Joseph, which of course the butler forgets to do. And Joseph gets to languish for 2 more years in prison. And then finally the day comes when Pharaoh has his dream. 2 dreams, in fact. And they don't know how to interpret them. And the butler finally goes, oh, wait a minute. It's all coming back to me now. There's this guy down in prison that told me to remember him, but we won't bring that part up, who's down there ready to interpret some dreams. I think we should call him up. And of course, they call him up. They shave him. They dress him up because he looks like a train wreck because he's a prisoner, okay? So they bring him in before Pharaoh. He interprets the dreams. Pharaoh's impressed, and he says, who am I going to get to do this wonderful plan of saving up the abundance to take us through the famine, which was the interpretation of the dream. And of course, he decides Joseph should be that man. And at that point, Joseph kind of comes into his own and becomes the number 2 man in Egypt. And everything begins to go great. He's got 7 years of wonderful stuff. And then, of course, the famine kicks in, and that's when the brothers reappear. And there's a famous back and forth with the brothers where he recognizes them, they don't recognize him. Finally, they do. And then ultimately, not only do all the brothers come down to Egypt, but Jacob comes down as well, and all of Israel ends up in Egypt for 400 years. And Joseph's presence there is what allows them to come and grow and ultimately to thrive and accomplish God's long-term purposes. There you go. 14 chapters in well under 14 minutes. I hope you're impressed. Now, the reason I tell that story is not for the story's sake, but for all of the questions that would have come up in Joseph's mind through the course of that time. And that's what I'd like to think just a little bit about with you for the rest of our time together. It was quite a tale. I tell it in just a handful of minutes, but I want you to think about spending 13, 14 years in slavery or prison. That was not a good deal. and you stop and ask, why was this happening? And the first thing that you would have to do if you were doing that is, like I say, to ask the question, why? And you realize, the real answer to that question is because of how he was treated by his family, right? Here's the first deep question I would like to ask on Joseph's behalf. Why do those who are supposed to love me hurt me instead? Why do those who are supposed to love me hurt me instead? Of course, that's true of the butler. It's true of Potiphar. It's true of Potiphar's wife. But most of all, it's true of his own family members. Why do those who are supposed to love me hurt me instead? Now, I imagine in this audience, there's an awful lot of people who could ask that question themselves because your family has hurt you. 20 years of pastoral ministry, I heard that question time and time and time again. And the interesting thing that happened was very often that question was asked as if it were a rhetorical question, one that had an obvious or implied answer, namely usually, because my family are such a bunch of jerks. Because my family are doing so many things wrong. That was the implied answer to that question. But I would like to suggest that we shouldn't ask that as a rhetorical question, but a real question, and ask why? Why does my family hurt me? And let me just answer that question in the case of Joseph, in the hopes that perhaps it might apply to you as well. Why did Joseph's family hurt him? Simply speaking, because Joseph's family was a dysfunctional mess. It really was. It was a train wreck of a family. His dad was a liar and a cheat who got his birthright and inheritance by deception and lies, right? You've read the story of Jacob. His mom was no better. Mom was also liar and thief. She not only stole from her own father, she also deceived her own husband regarding Jacob. So mom was as bad as dad, and mom's dad is like the world record setter for lying, cheating, and stealing. Read the story of Laban. The guy's amazing. Never met a lie he didn't like. So this is the family of origin of the family of origin. And then he was born into a bigamous family. There's not one wife, but two. And actually not even really only two, because each of the wives had a maiden that traveled with her, and she also became parents to Jacob's sons. So you have 4 different mothers in this family. It's a mess. Joseph's mother was the favored wife, but she was infertile and spent years being infertile, watching all the other women have sons while she had none. And then finally, when Joseph comes, all of her pain, all of her tears, all of her hopes, all of her dreams get dropped upon his head. How would you like to have that inheritance when you finally show up? And then, not that long afterward, she gets pregnant. She has another son, but she dies during childbirth. So Joseph, in effect, becomes orphaned relative to that family structure. His dad obviously showed favoritism. His brothers hated him for it. This group wasn't really part of the human race. They were part of the human demolition derby. And so you ask the question, why did the people who were supposed to love him hurt him instead? And the answer is because they learned hurt in their own family. They learned jealousy, not love. They learned blame, not grace. They learned lying, not truth-telling. Because they were victims of injustice within their own families, victims of prejudice, victims of ill treatment, they had a chaotic family structure, which, like many blended family structures, didn't blend. It didn't mix. It didn't braid. It just sat in the frying pan like liver and onions. And no matter how long you cook liver and onions, they never mix and they never taste any better. That was their family structure. And that leads us to the simple but difficult answer to the question. Why is it that the people who are supposed to love you hurt you instead? For the simple reason, the people who hurt people are hurt people. The people who hurt people are almost always hurt people. They hurt because they themselves have been hurt. We have inheritances of hurt. They come from our fathers, they come from our fathers' fathers, and they come from their father before them. Now, the interesting thing about hurt is not just that it gets passed on in a chain, but also that there's something you can do about that chain, and that's what makes Joseph's story so interesting. If you think of the story I've just told, you suddenly have this sick feeling like hurting people is like dominoes, a domino chain. You know, you set up all those dominoes, and then you just push the first one, and bam, 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 all the dominoes fall in a great big crash. I push you, you push him, you push her, she pushes the person in front, and on goes that chain of hurt until we all fall down in a pile of hurt. And if you've ever set up like one of those little domino chains, have you ever done that? And get like 3/4 of the way through, and then like you straighten up, and when you do that, your foot back behind you hits the first domino, and all of a sudden you see the whole thing go, and you have this sick feeling that there's nothing in the world you can do to stop it. And the interesting thing is that that is the lie. You can stop it. If you're ever doing that, the thing you need to do is not look at where the dominoes are falling, but look ahead and just pull 1 or 2 dominoes out of the chain. And you know what happens? Those last 2 dominoes fall over, they don't have anything to hit, and the whole chain stops. And you know how you stop a chain of hurt? Is by stepping out of line and saying, though I was hurt, I will not pass it on. And the world is waiting for people who will step out of the chain of hurt and say, it ends with me. Joseph is a great example of this. When we are hurt, there's really 2 different types of people that we hurt back. Oftentimes, our first choice is to hurt back the person who hurt us. You've seen this on the playground. One little kid smacks the other little kid. That little kid turns around and smacks the original kid, and they have a little smack fest, and they work it all out there on the playground. You hurt the person who hurt you. But what happens to a lot of us is that the hurt happens at one point, and it simmers for a while, and by the time it rises back up to the surface for us, there's other people around us, so we hurt someone else in response to the hurt that we got back then. Now, obviously, Joseph would be in that position because he was shipped off as a slave. He couldn't go back and hurt his brothers, so his only option was to hurt other people around him. But the interesting thing is that's exactly what he didn't do. He's confronted by Potiphar's wife, and his response is, how can I do this evil thing against God? I'm not going to hurt someone else back in response to the situation I've been in. I won't hurt Potiphar. I won't hurt Potiphar's wife. What do? Of course, they hurt him again. So what happens when he gets to prison? Well, again, he makes the most of that, not the least of that. He doesn't go hurting other people. The butler, when he finally remembers Joseph did it, he doesn't say, by the way, here's what you should do with the grain, and here's what we should do with the butler who forgot me for the last 2 years. Joseph doesn't choose to hurt the other people around him. And interestingly enough, when chapter 42 rolls around, he doesn't choose to hurt the people who hurt him himself. When his brothers finally reappear, and he has all the power in the world to hurt them any way he wants to, he refuses to do that, and ultimately gives us that wonderful phrase, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And he stops the chain. I'll never forget being at a Bible study with a batch of people. I can't even remember what passage we'd been looking at or what we were studying, but the thing that we were asked to do is to kind of break up into groups of 3 or 4 people and just share a little bit about the legacy that you want to leave within your own family. We were all parents of young kids at that time, and so it was a really good question to ask is, what is my family legacy going to be? And so we had an interesting batch of people. These were a lot of doctors, physicians, some very capable people were in the room at that time. And we had a lot of big dreams of things we want to do. I want my kids to be involved in, fill in the blank, wonderful thing. I would like to have as a legacy of my family, churches planted on every continent around the world. And you go, oh, hey, that's a good one. And you're working away around the room, and then we hit one of my friends. And he says, I want my legacy to be that I broke the chain. Said, my mom was an alcoholic. I remember getting the call from the police about my dad to come down to Skid Row and identify his body because he died as a drunk on Skid Row. My wife's mother was an alcoholic. My wife's father was an alcoholic. We're all alcoholics backwards up the chain, and I want the chain to stop here. One of the joys of my life has been watching that friend and his wife and his children grow up through the course of the last 24 years now. And to watch him go through the somewhat tedious, difficult, and sometimes painful task of breaking a chain, of stepping out of the line of hurt and saying, I'm not going to pass on to my children what was passed on to me. The chain of hurt ends here. It's a remarkably simple answer, right? It's just really difficult to do. Welcome to the deep questions. Second question that confronted Joseph. How long will my faithfulness be forgotten? Can you imagine 13 years in prison? And by the end of his time, that's practically half of his life. He's 30 when he finally gets out. 13 years in prison. How long, oh Lord? Isn't it enough yet? Joke over. Isn't it time for something else to happen? How long will my faithfulness be forgotten? Joseph at that point had been a victim of sex trafficking, or of human trafficking, sexual harassment, unjust imprisonment. He'd grown up in a context where it was basically frosted with ungrateful neglect or hardship from his brothers. His whole life seemed to be marked by his personal righteousness and the unrighteousness of those around him. And here's the simple answer to that deep question. Nothing is ever forgotten. Nothing is ever forgotten. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, one will reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. So let us not grow weary of doing good. Jesus says, truly, no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, there's no one who will not receive 100-fold, now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and children and lands, with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. Your faithfulness is never forgotten. Therefore, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor is not in vain. It does not go unseen, and it will not go unrewarded. Your deeds are not forgotten, and you are not forgotten. It's one of the interesting things of this story, the way it is told in Genesis, just linguistically, the way the narrative is written. there's a repeated pattern where it says, and God was with Joseph. And just so you know, that usually comes right before something really, really terrible happens to Joseph, just so you know. And God was with Joseph, and he was thrown in prison for 13 years, but God was with Joseph. God's presence is with you. Your good deeds are not forgotten. You are not forgotten. God always promises his presence in the midst of a story and his goodness at the end of the story. The only problem is that we like short stories, and God likes Russian novels. So we have this whole long process where we may indeed have the presence of God, but the goodness of God seems a long, long way away. And so we wait and we ask, how long will I be forgotten? And the answer is, you're never forgotten. It's just God's writing a Russian novel and you're in it. The third question. Must I forgive? Ooh, there's a good question. It's an interesting story of Joseph, how it develops. Joseph, as you can tell, did not use his bitterness for the way he had been treated as an excuse for not doing what was right or what was good or doing his best, so to speak. So wherever he went, he thrived. He made the most of the situation he was in, and that is often a thing that people who have been wronged refuse to do. They're bitter and they want everyone to know that they have been wronged, and so they refuse to do what is right because they have been wronged. Joseph did not do that. He was very willing to do what was right. And it's easy to think that perhaps he really had forgiven, made everything right and all that, and I don't even know what all went on in his heart and mind and soul in that regard because it isn't really told to us in the narrative. But it is interesting. 13 years in prison, then 7 good years, right? You might think that the bad time, the silence of God. Notice, I should have pointed this out at the outset. This whole story begins with God talking to Joseph, right? It isn't born of God's silence, but of God talking. The problem is as soon as God sends something, everything goes to pot, and then you have 13 years of silence, or perhaps 20, depending upon how you want to look at it. Because I'd like to point out at this point, after 13 years, things began to go good, but the one thing that was never resolved was what in the world was the point of this? I'm now down in Egypt and everything's going good. I'm rich, I'm famous, I've got a cute wife, nice kids, the whole thing's going great. But why in the world did all this happen? And it's interesting to read this story, discover he does indeed get a wife from a very, high leading priestly family, and he has 2 kids. He names them Manasseh and Ephraim. You know what those names mean? I have forgotten and I am fruitful. All of the past, he's saying, I have forgotten. And I am looking at where I am now, and I am fruitful. That is code word for I am over it. I am just over it. I am so done with my family, with the nasties, with the prison, with the crazy lady in my robe. I am so done with that stuff. And then what happens? Chapter 42. Oh, bummer. See, this is chapter 41, and things are looking really good. And then his brothers show up. And it's like, Joseph, we're not quite done yet. You may have forgotten, but you haven't forgiven. You may have become fruitful, but you haven't become reconciled. And we're about to stitch you back together again with your brothers. And I cannot imagine what went through Joseph's mind when that one morning he got up and he looked out at who was coming to buy grain that day and he saw his brothers. I can just imagine him shaking his head, oh Lord, do I have to? Do we have to go here? I am so over it. Do I have to forgive? The answer, yes. Yes. Simple answer. Very difficult to swallow. You do have to forgive. And let me just point out, there's a lot I could say about that forgiveness process, and you guys are familiar with a lot of that story. Let me just make one observation that was very, very important in this story. The key to Joseph's making sense of all of the rest of his life was a transition that took place when he was willing to forgive and be reconciled to his brothers. And here's how that worked. He was doing fine, right? He's rich, he's famous, got a couple kids, everything's peachy. He's ready to go ahead and write his own story, but he had to decide whether or not this whole thing would be about his story or about God's story. And God's story was about a promise that he had given to Abraham, about a promised land back in Canaan, about a set of descendants who would occupy that land and become as abundant as the stars of the sky or the sand on the sea. That was the story that God was telling, not some story about Joseph having some nice kids and a wife and a good life in Egypt. That wasn't the story. And the way for Joseph to get his story reattached to God's story was forgiveness. To become reunited to his family, to reveal to his brothers who he was, to get all of his brothers to come back down to Egypt, and to be protected and live there for 400 years. And you start thinking about what would have happened if Joseph had said, I really am done with it. Would have been a different story. There wouldn't have been Israel in Egypt. There wouldn't have been an exodus from Egypt. There wouldn't have been a promised land conquest. There wouldn't have been a kingdom in the promised land. There wouldn't have been a King David. There wouldn't have been a messianic king. There wouldn't have been a crucifixion. There wouldn't have been a resurrection. There wouldn't have been our story of redemption. If Joseph had refused the possibility of being reconciled to his brothers. And when he joined into that story is when we were able to join into that story as well. His original tale might have been nicer, but it wasn't God's story. And let that be the final question. And that is, whose story do you want to live? Yours or God's? One of the hardest truths that we ever have to face, put very eloquently by Donald Miller, he said, this is the most difficult lie I ever have to contend with, and that is this. Life is a story about me. And life isn't a story about you. And the weird thing is, even your life isn't a story about you. We don't make sense of Joseph's life until we tell it as a story about God, about his redemption, his salvation, and the purposes that he seeks to accomplish in this world. And one of the biggest challenges we face is to decide, am I willing to let my story be written into God's story? Am I willing to let him be the hero of my story? It's a little bit of a bummer, just like truth in advertising time here. When you're not the hero of the story, sometimes the last chapter you're in can be a bad one. It's really sad. In the case of Joseph, you have this interesting thing where the beginning of the story is good, the middle of the story is bad, and the end of the story is pretty good again. Then you read the story of Jeremiah. Things start out really good, they end up really bad. Read Lamentations. It's a nightmare. Isaiah began really good. You know how it ended? You don't get to read it in Isaiah because it ended by him being drawn and quartered. One leg tied to the horse that was headed north, another leg tied to a horse that was headed west, another arm tied to the horse that's headed south, and the fourth limb, his other arm, tied to the horse that's headed east, and they're all driven in opposite directions. And he's torn into 4 pieces. Wow. Does that make it a bad story? Well, it all depends upon who the story's about. We know Isaiah because he wrote the lyrics to the Messiah, right? I mean, how do you tell the story of Isaiah? Does it stop with him, or is it part of the story of the Messiah? Is it part of salvation history? And such a huge part of our lives is willing to let the story not be about you, And sometimes that makes sense of the most difficult and even tragic endings to chapters in a person's life, when you stop and realize it isn't really a tragedy because it's written into another story that really does have a good ending. And that's the beautiful thing about being attached to God's story. It's a story that doesn't end in a funeral but in a wedding. It's not a tragedy, it's a comedy. The final chapter is the wedding feast of the Lamb. We do get to live together eternally in a joyful and a wonderful way. It's a beautiful story you're attaching yourself to. And the particular chapter that you're written into, well, you're not the author. You're just the character that's written into the story that God is telling. Not an easy answer, but it is simple. It can be hard to live with, but it's not complex to understand. It's just not about you.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.